Do you hate the look of algae in your shrimp tanks? In this video, I'm going to show you 5 ways you can help keep algae under control. And in this video, I'm not just going to give you a list of 5 ways, I'm going to tell you why each of these techniques help cut down on the amount of algae growing in your shrimp tanks. I have used all 5 of these techniques in one single tank here, and at the end of this video, I will show you that tank so you can see how I've got the algae under control. Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Richard, and I'm the author of the Neocaridina Shrimp Handbook. So algae in and of itself isn't actually a bad thing. It's a totally natural part of keeping an aquarium. In the wild, Mother Nature has algae growing everywhere she can. Algae processes waste. Algae helps clean your aquarium water. Ironically, an aquarium absolutely jam-packed with algae is typically a healthy aquarium. It's a great place for fish and shrimp to live. But we aquarists don't like the look of algae. We have become accustomed to think a tank full of algae is a bad tank. It means you're doing something wrong. It doesn't look nice. So whilst on the one hand, I don't worry about algae, I will share with you my 5 techniques for keeping it under control. And the first of these is to add an algae eater. Now, keeping algae under control in a fish tank is relatively simple. You add a bristlenose plecker or a hill stream roach or whatever it might be, something that spends its day on the glass chomping on the algae. But in a shrimp tank, in a nano tank, that's often not so simple. I couldn't add a bristlenose pleco to a 5-gallon tank. It just wouldn't work. They're just too messy and they'll quickly destroy the water quality. Now, what you can add to a shrimp tank is snails. And I know, gross, snails are terrible. Snails massively overpopulate. You just end up with a tank full of snails, right? Now, if you choose a ram's horn snail or a pond snail, yes, they breed rapidly. And although they only breed to the amount of available food, often we end up with more snails than shrimp, and that's not the look we're going for. But if you add something that breeds very slowly, like a rabbit snail, or if you add a snail that doesn't actually breed in your aquarium at all, like a nerite snails, much like a Amano shrimp, their young have to pass through a saltwater phase or a brackish water phase before they develop. They won't reproduce in our freshwater aquariums. You don't have to add a snail that reproduces rapidly. You could also try adding a different shrimp. If you add a Amano shrimp to your cherry shrimp tank, to your Neocaridina shrimp tank, the Amano shrimp, again, like the nerite snails, they won't reproduce in your aquarium, but they're absolute algae-eating machines. Amano shrimp are especially good at eating hair algae and blackbeard algae and things that many other aquarium inhabitants won't touch. So tip number 1 for keeping your algae under control is add an appropriate algae eater. Now, suggestion number 2 is to add live aquarium plants. And many of you will know I'm mad on aquarium plants. I add aquarium plants to every single tank I have. Why does adding aquarium plants help keep your algae under control? Well, algae grows when there are nutrients in the water. The algae is there and it absorbs those nutrients. Now, when we add aquarium plants, and especially fast-growing aquarium plants, like water wisteria, like hygropheders, like cryptocorynes, plants that grow rapidly, they suck the nutrients out of the water. And the fewer nutrients that are available, the less algae you're going to get. Essentially, you can't help having nutrients in your water. Fish food breaking down creates nutrients in the water. The fish and shrimp going to the bathroom, their waste essentially creates nutrients in the water. You cannot have a system without nutrients. So by adding live aquarium plants, we essentially put something else in the tank that's going to absorb those nutrients and hopefully outcompete the algae. Now, you'll never, no matter what technique you use, you'll never have no algae. This is all about keeping the algae under control. This is about growing a plant that will reduce the amount of nutrients available for the algae. And if we stack up live plants with algae eaters, we perhaps take a tank and we put some crypts and some water wisteria in there, and we add some rabbit snails and maybe a couple of Amano shrimp, we now have the basis for really keeping that algae under control. There will be fewer nutrients in the water for the algae in the first place. And if the algae does start to develop, the snails, the shrimp, whatever, the ottocinclus, tiny little algae eaters, they will eat it, hopefully, before it gets a proper foothold and starts to take over your aquarium. Now, tip number 3 for keeping your algae under control seems massively counterintuitive. And that is, assuming you already have live plants, add fertilizer. And I read so often on forums and Facebook posts and in YouTube comments where people say, I've got algae, so the first thing I did was I stopped adding fertilizer. The thinking there is clearly that the algae is enjoying the fertilizer. The algae is living off the fertilizer. But if you have live aquarium plants, you want those plants to be growing big and strong and healthy and outcompeting the algae. One of the best ways to do that is to feed them, is to put in a fertilizer so your plants are bigger and stronger and growing faster, giving them more chance to outcompete the algae. I definitely would never stop fertilizing an aquarium just because I start to see algae. Now, you don't want to overdose. You don't want to get your bottle of fertilizer and just dump the whole thing in, because clearly there'll be too much in there. But if you're dosing an appropriate amount for the tank you have, for the plants you have growing, those plants will grow faster, be stronger, and do a better job of outcompeting the algae. And this is all about keeping the algae under control. You're never going to eradicate it. You're never going to have an algae-free tank. You'll drive yourself insane if you try and make your tank algae-free. What we're trying to do is set up a system that keeps the algae at an absolute minimum. Now, technique number 4 to keep your algae under control is to regulate the amount of light you're adding to the tank. Now, regulate it in 2 ways. The first thing to do is to make sure your aquarium light is on a timer. If you put the light on a timer, then you know it comes on for the same number of hours each day. At some point in time, almost all of us have turned on our aquarium light, gone off, done our thing, gone to work, gone out for dinner after work, ended up staying at a buddy's house, come back the next morning and realized the damn light's been on for nearly 24 hours. Excess light like that is an absolute recipe for too much algae. By putting your light on a timer, no matter how busy your day gets, no matter what you end up doing, even if you go away on holiday, your light will be on for the same number of hours. And that's good for plant growth and means there's not excess light for the algae to use. The other thing you need to do is make sure you only provide enough light for the plants. If your light runs for 12, 14, 16 hours a day, you're putting too much light into that aquarium. The plants can only use so much light before they essentially say they're done for the day. Plants won't grow 24 hours a day if you leave the light on 24 hours a day. The plants will grow for 8, 10, 12 hours and then they'll shut down. And all that extra light is perfect for algae. I typically start my aquariums at a maximum of 8 hours. And once the plants start to grow, I might increase that over time to 9 and then 10. But if I've got a tank and the algae is creeping in and the plants aren't growing as much as I like, I might reduce that to 7 hours. I might even reduce it to 6 hours until the plants really get going. And again, we can stack all of these things up. We put our light on a timer. We have lots of live plants. We add fertilizer to make sure those plants are as big and strong and growing as quickly as we can. And we add an algae eater. And now we end up with a tank that is really imbalanced, because the algae is really the result of a tank that is not in balance. We need to balance up the plants and the algae eaters and the light and the fertilizer, get everything in balance. And we'll have a tank that, whilst it will have some algae, because algae is not the enemy, the algae will be under control. Now, technique number 5 for keeping algae under control is to add floating plants. And floating plants are an absolute miracle when it comes to keeping algae under control, because what they'll do is they'll spread across the surface of the tank and they will reduce the amount of light getting through. In these tanks here, I've got dwarf water lettuce, but you can also use something as simple as duckweed. Anything that creates that green carpet across the top will reduce the amount of light that's getting down into the aquarium, but they will also suck nutrients out of the tank, meaning there's fewer nutrients available for the algae. Floating plants, on the whole, are nutrient-sucking machines. They get the best of both worlds. Their roots are in the water, absorbing all of the nutrients that are in the water, and their leaves are on the surface, meaning there is unlimited oxygen and CO2 for them to take from the atmosphere. In fact, if you just implemented one of these tips in this video, my recommendation would be go for floating plants. Go for a fast-growing floating plant like dwarf water lettuce, like even duckweed. Although duckweed typically infests every tank you have, it's actually not a bad plant. It's great for helping keep algae under control. And again, as you can see in many of these tanks, I'm stacking up having the light under control, having live plants, having algae eaters, having floating plants, fertilizing those plants. Trying to create a system that is in balance creates a healthy system for my fish and shrimp. And it's stacking up each of these 5 techniques that I've done here in my dwarf gourami tank. This tank not only houses a male dwarf gourami and some yellow Neocaridina shrimp, but it has live plants. It has ram swan snails. The light is on a timer. I have floating plants, and I fertilize those plants once a week to make sure they're as big and strong and healthy as they can be. I've used each of these techniques to create a balanced aquarium. It's small, but it's in balance. And there is some algae in there, but it's not out of control. It looks natural and it works as an overall system to keep my water clean and healthy and a great place where my fish and shrimp can live. In fact, I recently set up another heavily planted aquarium, which is proving to be an absolute heaven for red cherry shrimp. And you can find out how I did it by watching this video next. Thanks for watching.